Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I stopped arguing with my brother and started keeping receipts. 30 days later, I signed a document that changed both our lives, and what came next caught him completely off guard. For as long as I can remember, my older brother Jake has had this way of turning every family dinner into his personal stage. It did not matter if the rest of us were catching up about normal things like health insurance headaches, kids applying for college, or someone switching jobs. The moment Jake got going, everything shifted to his world of tech startups, funding rounds, and what he claimed were revolutionary features. He would lean back, make some sweeping comment about how not everyone was cut out for risk, and then, without fail, he would look directly at me. It was never subtle, and it was never in good faith. It was a performance designed to make me defend myself, because once I did, he could win by laughing it off or turning the conversation into a "see how defensive she is" routine. For years, I took the bait, explained my contracts, mentioned new clients, pointed out our retention rate, and every time, it felt like I was auditioning for approval in my own family. At some point last year, I realized the real mistake was not Jake's arrogance, but my constant need to explain. I was playing his game, and I was always going to lose because the rules were built around who could make the louder claim, not who had the stronger case. So I stopped. I adopted a new rule. No more defending, no more explaining, no more trying to impress anyone at that table. I would let the facts pile up where they mattered, in the real world, and I would let silence do the work when his exaggerations hit the air. Meanwhile, at my job, I was actually having the kind of quarter that makes or breaks careers. I had been leading product at a B2B platform most people outside the industry would never have heard of, but inside, we were known for being ruthlessly reliable. Nothing glamorous, no headlines about being the Uber of anything, but steady revenue, clean books, and, most importantly, enterprise clients who did not leave once they signed on. My colleague Maya, who doubled as our CFO and my closest ally at work, and I had just locked in 2 major renewals and even closed a pilot with a Fortune 500 company because we refused to oversell. They wanted one feature built fast, and instead of pretending we already had it, I told them the truth, committed to a timeline, and delivered exactly that. No drama, no overpromising, just competence. They doubled their spend for the next year. While this was happening, my mom casually mentioned over Sunday coffee that Jake had announced a huge new partnership. She was glowing with pride, repeating his words like they were gospel. I did not correct her, even though I knew from a friend in the industry that the deal was just a co-marketing arrangement with no guaranteed revenue. I smiled, told her I was happy for him, and went back to stirring my coffee. The old me would have explained the difference between a revenue contract and a marketing handshake. The new me let it sit. Thanksgiving rolled around a few weeks later, and as expected, Jake found his opening. Between turkey and pie, he launched into his usual monologue about the risks of being a real founder compared to playing it safe in corporate. He looked at me with that smirk that said, "Here we go again," waiting for me to jump in and defend myself. But I did not. Instead, I asked one question: "What's your net retention rate right now?" He blinked, shifted in his seat, mumbled something about growth being the priority, and then tried to laugh it off. I did not say another word. The silence landed harder than any speech I could have given, because everyone at the table could tell he did not have an answer. I did not push. I changed the subject and asked Grandma about her new neighbor's dog. For me, that was the first win, not because I humiliated him, but because I finally broke my old rule of over-explaining. I had taken myself out of his script, and the control shifted without me raising my voice. I remember walking out of that dinner and thinking, this is the way forward. No more proving, just positioning. The funny thing is, once you stop defending, you start noticing all the little cracks in the story the other person tells. About a month later, I got a call from one of Jake's vendors. They were trying to figure out if I knew anyone in accounts payable at my company because they had not been able to get a straight answer from his side, and they were desperate to find out if he was in trouble. That was the moment I knew the silence was about to get very loud. Can you guess what happened next? The call from Jake's vendor kept echoing in my head for days, because even though the person on the other end tried to keep their tone casual, you could hear the urgency between every polite word. The kind of urgency that comes when you are owed money and you are already running out of polite ways to ask for it, and the fact that they somehow connected me into this problem told me more than Jake ever had about what was really happening behind the curtain. I had not asked for details, and yet the details found me, and that was when it really sank in that all of his bragging about runway and growth mode might have been less about strategy and more about survival. I told myself I was not going to intervene, that I was not my brother's keeper, and that if he was reckless enough to burn bridges with vendors, then the consequences were his to face. But even as I repeated that line in my head, I started noticing other signals I would have ignored in the past. There were the vague group chat updates about working with new partners, but never naming them, the carefully cropped photos of laptops and coffee shops instead of actual demos, and the way our mom proudly repeated phrases like scaling up and network effects, without realizing she was parroting buzzwords that meant nothing without numbers behind them. It was like hearing an echo chamber and knowing the original sound was weak. Around the same time, I happened to run into Liam, his co-founder, outside a coffee shop near my office, and the encounter was short but telling in ways Jake's monologues never were. Liam looked tired, not just physically but in the way someone looks when they are carrying problems they cannot say out loud, and when I asked how things were going, he smiled with that polite half-grin people wear when the truth is bad, but they do not want to get into it. He said something vague about pushing hard toward the next round, and then quickly steered the conversation toward asking about me, which was all the confirmation I needed. If the business were truly thriving, he would have been glowing, proud, even smug. Instead, he was trying to avoid eye contact with his own reality. Meanwhile, in my own world, things were moving in the exact opposite direction, not flashy or dramatic, but steadily upward in a way that gave me actual confidence. One of our clients, Dina from a Fortune 500 company, had asked about a feature that Jake's company had been pitching aggressively, and instead of pretending we had it the way I knew Jake did, I told her honestly that we did not. Explained what we could do instead, and promised a timeline for a smaller but real solution. 2 weeks later, when that small solution was live and actually solving her team's bottleneck, she expanded her contract, and I walked out of that meeting thinking how different the two strategies were. Jake chased the illusion of size, while I doubled down on the strength of substance, and even though his way won applause in family conversations, mine was the one the market kept rewarding. I stayed completely quiet in the family group chat, where he posted about exciting announcements that never came with press releases anyone could verify, because I had finally understood that silence was my sharpest weapon. Every word I did not say built a pressure that would eventually land harder than any argument, and I could feel the shift happening even if nobody else saw it yet. But the real turning point for me came a few nights later when Liam texted me out of nowhere, and I could tell he had debated for hours before hitting send. It was a screenshot of an internal slide deck Jake had been showing investors, and in it, clear as day, were revenue numbers that I knew could not be true, because the math was so sloppy that even a non-finance person could see the inconsistencies. Worse, there was a section that claimed a feature existed when I had first-hand knowledge that it did not, because my own client had asked for it. I stared at that screenshot for a long time, because it was one thing to suspect someone was bluffing, and it was another thing entirely to see the evidence typed out in big bold numbers. I did not send it to anyone. I did not confront Jake. I did not even reply to Liam right away. Instead, I sat with it, because I knew the temptation would be to fire back, expose him, and get that rush of being proven right, but I also knew that was the fastest way to lose control of the narrative. The smarter move was to hold it, to let the evidence sit where I could use it when it mattered, not when my ego wanted release. That night, I called Maya, my CFO partner in all things strategy, and told her what had landed in my lap. She did not sound surprised, which made me wonder if she had already guessed. She said something I will never forget. "We are not in the business of teaching your brother lessons. We are in the business of protecting our future. Don't confuse the two." And she was right, because the goal was not to punish Jake for his arrogance. It was to make sure that when the walls finally caved in, my company would be positioned to catch what was worth catching and leave the rest behind. Still, even with that clarity, I could not shake the feeling that the walls were closer than anyone realized. If vendors were calling me, if Liam was sending screenshots, if Jake was padding decks with fake numbers, then we were not talking about years or even many months. We were talking about weeks, maybe days, before reality caught up, and I had to decide whether I was willing to be ready or whether I was going to sit back and hope someone else cleaned up the mess. And that was when I made a choice. I was not going to expose him in some dramatic family scene, I was not going to leak documents to embarrass him, and I was not going to waste another minute trying to convince anyone to see through his act. I was going to prepare, quietly and carefully, to make sure that when the collapse came, I would be standing in the one place that mattered most. Can you guess what happened next? When Liam finally sent me that screenshot, I knew on some level that I had crossed into a place where there was no going back, because once you have proof in your hands that someone has been bending reality to the point of outright fabrication, you cannot unknow it. You cannot unsee it, and you cannot pretend to yourself that the situation is merely about sibling rivalry or bruised egos at family dinners, because it becomes something much larger, something that touches legality, responsibility, and the reputations of everyone tied to the person doing the bending. I stared at the slide long after I had first opened it, reading the numbers over and over, trying to find some alternative explanation, some innocent mistake or formatting issue that would make sense of it, but there was no mistake. Only deliberate inflation, refunds counted as revenue, and features listed as shipped that had never even left the planning stage. The slide was not just sloppy, it was dishonest, and it made me sick to my stomach to think about how many people he had already shown it to. In the past, I would have been tempted to print it out, bring it to dinner, and lay it on the table like evidence in a courtroom, daring him to spin his way out of something that clear. But I had already learned that chasing those kinds of public wins was a losing strategy, because it always made me look like the aggressor and him like the victim of my supposed hostility. I did not want a family brawl where Mom begged us both to stop, Dad tried to mediate, and Grandma shook her head, disappointed in both of us. I wanted something cleaner, sharper, and permanent, and that meant resisting the urge to fire prematurely and instead holding my position until the moment was right. The first person I called was Maya, because she has a way of cutting through my emotions and forcing me to think like an operator instead of a sibling. I told her exactly what Liam had sent me, and she was quiet for a long time, long enough that I started pacing my apartment, convinced she was about to tell me to leak it or to call him out. Instead, she finally said, in her calm, measured way, that what I was holding was leverage, and leverage only matters if you know how to use it without burning yourself. She reminded me that Jake's mess was not mine to expose, and that if I acted impulsively, I would risk dragging my own credibility into a mudfight I did not need to enter. She said, "We are not here to punish him, Aaron. We are here to make sure that when the collapse comes, we are standing in the right place to pick up what matters and leave behind what does not." That line settled me, because I realized she was right. I was not his executioner, I was not his fixer, and I was not responsible for cleaning up his ego. But I was responsible for positioning my company so that if the floor fell out from under him, we could take the only things of value he still had, his data pipelines, his engineers, and his client list, and fold them into something stronger. That meant documentation, not confrontation. So I spent the next week pulling together everything I could quietly confirm without crossing any lines. I checked public filings, dug through credit reports, and discovered something that shifted the ground under the whole situation. Jake had taken out a secured line of credit, and worse, he had personally guaranteed it. That meant he was not just gambling investor money, he was gambling his own future, and if the company went down, the bank was going to come straight for him. Knowing that gave me a strange mix of anger and pity, because while part of me thought, he deserves whatever he gets for lying to investors and stiffing vendors, another part of me could not help but see the arrogance of a man who thought he was invincible signing papers that tethered his personal finances to a sinking ship. I kept that information locked in a folder labeled "If Needed," a folder Maya and I built together that contained every vendor complaint, every late payment notice, every inflated claim we had stumbled across. We did not touch it, we did not use it, we just kept adding to it, like stacking kindling for a fire we were not yet ready to light. Around this time, Mom called to invite me to Sunday dinner, saying she thought it would be good for me and Jake to find common ground before Easter rolled around, and I almost laughed at the irony of it. There was no common ground left, not when I had proof in my inbox that he was actively misleading people, not when I knew he was standing on financial quicksand, and not when the only thing keeping him afloat was bravado. I told her I was busy with work, which was true, but what I did not say was that I had already moved beyond the stage of needing to win arguments at the table. I was already playing the long game, and dinners were just noise. The hardest part was not telling Grandma, because she has always had the sharpest radar for nonsense, and I knew that if I even hinted at what I had seen, she would press me until I cracked, and then the whole family would be dragged into it. So I said nothing, not because I was afraid of Jake, but because I understood that silence was now my shield and my sword. The less I said, the more powerful my eventual move would be, and I had no intention of wasting it in a family living room where the only witnesses were people too invested in peacekeeping to admit the truth. The question that haunted me every night was how far I was willing to go, because there is a difference between protecting your own future and actively dismantling someone else's, and I needed to be sure that when the time came, I could live with my choice. That screenshot burned in my mind like a warning, reminding me that the collapse was no longer hypothetical, it was imminent, and the only thing left for me to decide was whether I was ready to step into the vacuum it would leave. Only 1% of people know the secret. You do not push a wall, you remove a brick. And staring at that folder of evidence, I realized we had already found the brick. By the time winter slipped into early spring, the situation around Jake's company had reached a point where the cracks were no longer hairline fractures hidden under a layer of confidence and buzzwords, but gaping holes that no amount of charm could paper over. And I knew with absolute certainty that the collapse was not a matter of if but when. Vendors had stopped speaking in polite euphemisms and were beginning to leave voicemails that carried the edge of frustration rather than courtesy. His co-founder Liam was looking more like a man calculating escape routes than one planning a growth strategy. And the internal numbers that had landed in my lap made it clear the house of cards was one gust of wind away from total ruin. Maya and I had been patient, disciplined, and deliberate, keeping our folder of documentation tucked safely away. But now the question hanging over every conversation was no longer whether we could act, but whether we had the courage to pull the trigger at the exact moment when the balance of power tilted completely in our favor. The breakthrough came not through some dramatic confrontation, but through a quiet conversation with a contact Maya had at the bank, who confirmed what we already suspected. The secured line of credit Jake had taken was bleeding, and the lender was actively exploring options to offload the risk. That was the opening, because in business, whoever holds the debt often holds the power, and if we could acquire that debt at a fraction of its value, we would not need to fight Jake in court or drag him through reputational mud. We could simply make an offer that he would have no choice but to accept. Maya handled the details with the precision of a surgeon, negotiating with the bank until we secured the distressed debt for pennies on the dollar, and I remember sitting in her office when the final paperwork came through, feeling a mix of adrenaline and disbelief that we had actually pulled it off without a single public word being spoken. Once that piece was secured, the rest unfolded with a kind of brutal elegance that only comes when preparation meets opportunity. We drafted an asset purchase offer that was deliberately narrow. We wanted the engineering team, specifically Liam and 2 senior developers whose work had real value. We wanted the client data pipelines, cleaned and vetted. And we wanted the intellectual property tied to the core platform, which, despite Jake's recklessness, had enough utility to be worth saving. What we did not want were the bloated marketing contracts, the hollow partnership deals, or the empty shell of a brand that had been built more on Jake's ego than on substance. The offer was designed to carve out the gold from the rubble, to save the pieces that deserved to live while leaving the dead weight behind. I insisted on one particular condition that felt as much personal as professional. All retained employees would have their health insurance carried over without interruption starting from day one, because I was not going to let Jake's failures wreck the lives of people who had actually done the work. That detail mattered to me in a way the numbers never could, because I had watched too many people in tech get tossed aside when flashy founders imploded, and I wanted at least one part of the story to end with stability instead of betrayal. I also pushed for a mutual non-disparagement clause, not because I thought Jake would honor it, but because it sent the message that his theatrics had no stage left to play on. He could posture all he wanted, but in legal terms, the curtain had come down. We sent the offer through counsel, no emotion, no speeches, just a clean document with a 48-hour response window, and then we waited. Jake called my phone within an hour, probably assuming he could appeal to me as his sister, but I let it go to voicemail. When he left a message trying to blend outrage with persuasion, I did not return the call. Instead, I sent one text that said, "Please route through counsel." It was cold, it was formal, and it was the line that made clear the personal leverage he had always used, our family ties, our shared history. His status as the golden child had no weight here anymore. Those 48 hours felt long, but not because I doubted the outcome. I knew he had no cards left, and I knew the bank's pressure meant his back was against the wall. What I felt instead was the gravity of years of imbalance finally shifting, not in some messy shouting match or dramatic unveiling, but in the quiet inevitability of a signature. When the signed acceptance came back, I stared at the PDF for a long time, not because I wanted to celebrate, but because I realized there was no victory lap to be had. I had one, but it did not feel like fireworks or applause. It felt like the air after a storm, heavy, damp, and strangely still. The truth is, taking over what remained of Jake's company was never about revenge in the cartoonish sense of seeing him humiliated. It was about reclaiming the power he had always wielded over me with his words, stripping away the illusion that he was untouchable and proving, to myself more than to anyone else, that patience and discipline can outlast bravado. The irony was that he had signed away the only things of value left in his world, and I had not needed to raise my voice or argue a single point at the family table to make it happen. This changed my life in just 30 days. He signed, and in that moment, the entire narrative flipped without me having to say a word. Easter dinner that year felt like the last test in a long series of battles I had been quietly preparing for, because by the time we all sat down at the table, the deal was already signed, the engineers had their start dates with full health coverage, the intellectual property had been transferred, and the folders of documentation we had kept locked away had been rendered unnecessary by the simple finality of Jake's signature on the asset purchase agreement. Yet for all of that, none of it had been spoken out loud to the family, which meant the stage was still set for him to do what he always did, to posture, to brag, to make himself the center of attention at my expense. And I had decided long before walking in the door that I would not be the one to break the silence with explanations or clarifications, because the entire point of the last few months was proving that you do not need to shout when you have already won. From the moment we sat down, I could feel Jake winding himself up the way he always did, leaning into conversation after conversation, interrupting when people talked about school or work, throwing in lines about investors, partnerships, or how risky the startup world was compared to what he called safe corporate ladders, and each time he looked at me directly, like he always had, with that half smile that dared me to rise to the bait, I kept my expression neutral, nodding politely, not flinching, not rewarding him with the defensive energy he thrived on. Years of practice had taught me that my silence was the one thing he could not handle, and even though I knew I held leverage that would crush any argument he tried to make, I stayed quiet. Because the victory I wanted was not to argue, but to let him talk himself into the position where someone else, someone he could not dismiss as jealous or insecure, would pierce the bubble. It happened faster than I expected. Between the ham and the potatoes, Jake launched into a speech about how not everyone could handle a real career in tech, about how most people preferred safety, about how taking risks was what separated leaders from followers, and the entire time, his eyes were on me, the way they always had been, as if the entire table existed only to witness my supposed inadequacy. For a second, I wondered if this would be the moment I finally broke my own rule and dropped the hammer, but before I could even consider it, Grandma Ruth, who had been quietly following the conversation with that hawk-like attentiveness she never lost even in her 80s, turned her head toward me and asked, in a voice so calm it might as well have been a verdict, "Is that why your company just bought his?" The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever experienced at a family gathering, because it was not the awkward hush that comes when people are uncomfortable but still pretending. And it was not the stunned pause that comes when someone blurts out something inappropriate. It was the kind of silence that comes when truth drops into a room so heavily that nobody dares to move. Nobody even knows how to recover. You could have heard a pin drop, and for the first time in years, I watched Jake's face go blank, his usual arsenal of jokes and dismissals suddenly out of reach, because the person who had said it was not me, the younger sister he could accuse of being bitter, but Grandma, the one person in the family whose word carried weight beyond dispute. I did not add to it, because adding to it would have weakened it, turned it into a gloating moment instead of a clean, surgical strike. I simply thanked Grandma for remembering that I worked in enterprise, asked Mom to pass the rolls, and let the silence do what words never could. It was the most powerful moment of the entire saga, not because I had engineered it, though in truth, my patience had set the stage, but because the validation came from someone who spoke without agenda, and in that instant, everything Jake had built his family persona on collapsed without me lifting a finger. Later, when the plates were cleared and people were trying awkwardly to redirect the evening back towards safer topics, I finally looked at Jake and told him the only thing I felt needed to be said, which was that the acquisition was not about destroying him but about saving what was worth saving, that Liam and the engineers had guaranteed jobs, that the product would continue to exist in a place where clients could trust it, and that the only reason I had pushed for a mutual non-disparagement clause was because I wanted the work to live without the distraction of old family feuds spilling into it. He did not answer right away, just stared down at his plate, and for a moment, I wondered if he would lash out or storm off, but instead he nodded, not in agreement exactly, more in resignation. Like someone who finally realizes there is no clever line left to throw, no stage left to perform on. Then I added one more line, because I wanted the ending to sting just enough to remind him that arrogance has consequences, but I also wanted to leave him a sliver of dignity. I told him that the deal included a small clause that allowed him, if he ever actually shipped a real feature and built something sustainable, to pitch me again in 2 years, and that I would genuinely listen. It sounded generous, but we both knew it was a mirror, a reminder that the door was closed unless he became the kind of builder he always pretended to be. It was the cleanest revenge I could deliver, because it gave him nothing in the present while forcing him to face the truth about who he had been. Walking out of that dinner, I felt no need to brag, no need to replay the moment or explain it to anyone, because the victory was already complete. Jake's empire of words had finally been met with the weight of reality, and the irony was that it had not come from me raising my voice, but from me refusing to play along until the silence itself became unbearable. Do you know your true worth? I did not until I stopped chasing applause at family dinners and started stacking real wins where they counted, and by the time Grandma spoke those words, I realized I had not only outlasted Jake's bravado, I had ended it with one sentence that will echo in our family forever.